Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, on this channel, we've talked about a lot of different kinds of ancient texts. We've looked at letters, diplomatic correspondence, omen texts, prayer texts, myths, and many more. We haven't even touched on other kinds of texts that exist in the ancient world. Grammars, dictionaries, abecedaries, which are exactly what they sound like, lists of letters in order, on and on. It is truly staggering how many kinds of texts there are from the ancient world. And not all of the texts we've recovered have even been translated yet. When we look at these sources, we can see that the ancient world, while certainly different from our own, had many of the same concerns. We see that ancient people were interested in mathematics, science, astronomy, and biology, like we still are today. They kept track of their wealth with receipts, and they made legal contracts. They told narrative stories. They wrote poetry. Finally, they were concerned with the divine, much as we are today. But when we look at what may be called religious texts, we don't find anything approaching what we would recognize as theology texts, at least in the modern sense. If you want to read a theology book nowadays, you'll find lots of options of varying quality and utility. Systematic theology is the in vogue flavor of theology most widely practiced in the West these days, but we don't find anything close to a parallel in the ancient world. We don't see ancient peoples writing orderly or reasoned treatises on their belief systems. Today we're going to look at why that might be the case. Now, this video is going to be a bit less archaeological and more theoretical, but it's an interesting idea that we also think is going to be valuable for us to understand today. It's a concept called the Divine Constellation. We'll look at what it is, how it works, and how this ancient concept might be relevant for us today. Let's dig in.
The idea of a divine constellation, at least the way that we're discussing it, was formulated by a scholar named Michael Hundley. I was first exposed to it in his article, Here a God, There a God. But he has a recent book that explores it in both greater breadth and depth. His model is one that I quite like. His book is almost 400 pages, so we can't go over all of it here, but I'm going to try to faithfully present its core ideas. We'll link it in the description below if you want to check it out. I'll also note Hundley's model was first developed specifically for understanding the divine in Mesopotamia, particularly during the Bronze Age. And it's a particularly good heuristic for that world. But it translates a bit differently to Syria Palestine in the Iron Age, which was a significantly different cultural zone with different cultural and theological traditions. That's not to say it doesn't translate at all, just that different places had different conceptions of the divine, and what works in one place in time will be somewhat different in another place in time. With that said, I do think, and Hundley does as well, that this model applies beyond Mesopotamia, even to the world of the ancient Israelites. So, enough caveats. What is a divine constellation? Hundley starts by noting that in our Western mindset, we tend to have what he calls a perspectival approach to understanding the divine. We're preoccupied with understanding a larger whole that is the sum of its parts. Idiosyncratic elements are discarded or discounted to create a cohesive, unified whole. Theology is systematized. In the ancient Near Eastern world, Hundley contends there was an aspective approach which focuses on individual components and expressing those completely at the expense of a unified whole. The whole is represented by juxtaposing complete elements, and when enough are put together, then the whole becomes understood. Representing those complete elements is emphasized at the expense of overall consistency, whereas with perspectival systematic theology, the consistency of the whole is paramount. Hundley notes, for them it is better to allow the deity to be practically limitless, even if that limitlessness baffles the mind, than to confine the deity to the limited boundaries that are a necessary product of the human mind. There's a recognition that any representation is approximate, and approximations are added on top of each other until a more complete picture emerges. Sort of like how a mosaic is a complete picture, but it's made up of many different colored elements. Now, these perspective and aspective approaches are very different from one another. Hundley notes that to the modern mind, this is maddeningly inconsistent, or worse, embarrassingly primitive. Whereas if an ancient person were to see a modern theological work, they would likely find such categorizations maddeningly restrictive, or worse, the height of hubris. I think he's quite right to identify that the conceptual background of ancient and modern theological thoughts are categorically different. And I would add that to understand ancient theological thought, we need to understand it on their terms as best we can.
So, what made a given being a god in the ancient world? It may seem like that would be simple to answer, but it's actually a bit complicated. Divinity was marked by several attributes. Now, not all deities had all of these attributes. Generally, the greater gods had more of them than the lesser deities, but lesser deities were still deities. The most obvious is if they are called a deity in a text. In addition to just flat out being called a god, many languages written in a cuneiform system have what are called divine determinatives, literally signs in the text which are not vocalized, but are markers that indicate something is divine. These can be applied to more obvious deities like Ishtar or Marduk, but also to objects like a deity's crown or weapon, the platform that their cult statue is on, or their cult statue itself, a ziggurat, a mountain or a river, city gates, plants, woods, semi-precious stones, justice and truth, diseases like epilepsy, numbers. All these things are given divine determinatives at one point or another in Mesopotamian texts. Other things like receiving prayers or offerings can mark someone or something as a deity. They may have aspects of divinity like potency, power above or over that of humans. They exhibit control over divine-like qualities. They inspire fear or dread. They have a quality of awesomeness to them. They control natural forces in a way beyond the capability of humans. They may be luminous, giving off light, or they may simply be in close proximity to something fully divine. Divinity was, it seems, somewhat contagious. And this is why things like the platform that a statue is on, or doors or gates, especially those of temples, would receive divine honors at times. So, how does one make sense of all of this? Well, this is where the Divine Constellation is helpful. When it comes to looking at the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, we can then see that the gods and other deified figures have a constellation of objects, attributes, and attendants that symbolically represent the deity and collectively establish the deity's identity. Hundley likens this to a constellation, like a constellation of stars. Now that's an important point to emphasize. We're talking about the divine constellation as an analogy, not literally or only a celestial constellation.
Now, I'm not particularly great at identifying constellations. I live in a large metropolitan area with a lot of light pollution, so that doesn't really help. But I can usually spot Orion. It has some of the brightest stars in the night sky, and the belt and the sword are easy to spot. But there are a lot of other stars in the constellation that are harder to spot. But they're still part of the constellation, but can be harder to see at times. And this is how Hundley envisions the Divine Constellation. There are core elements, bright stars that are essential to the constellation, which for Mesopotamian deities was an anthropomorphic core. The gods were understood to have bodies, but they were oversized with superhuman abilities. They had families and social structure, they had limits, they had moral and personal shortcomings. Radiating out from that anthropomorphic core were other elements like deified adornments, celestial bodies like stars and planets, minerals or metals, numbers, functions, forces, abstract qualities, geographical regions, and so on. Some elements were more closely associated with the deity than others, and some elements could be co-opted from other deities. The deity, the total divine figure, was the sum of its parts, and as more parts were added or co-opted from other deities, the divinity was further enhanced. Now, notably, some divine associations couldn't be co-opted. Hundley notes Shamash was a god associated with the sun, but never associated with the moon. Ashur, the national god of Assyria, was never the god of Babylon. But Ishtar was the goddess of both Nineveh and Arbela. While Ishtar in Nineveh was distinct from Ishtar of Arbela, both were complete representations of Ishtar. The people of Nineveh may have felt their Ishtar was different or more fully representing the heavenly divinity, but both were still Ishtar. Hundley succinctly says, although the fullness of the deity cannot be described or depicted in any one place, it could be experienced, albeit in mediated form, in every encounter with the deity. Whether that be in Nineveh or Arbela, you could fully encounter Ishtar in either representation as she was present in many places in many forms. So this fluidity can be hard to wrap your mind around, and I've certainly struggled with it as I've worked through all of these ideas, but has interesting implications for how people access the divine. If the deities surpassed humanity in every way, including human capabilities to conceive of the divine, then the gods were incomprehensibly distant. So how does one gain access to them? Well, this is where many of the more minor aspects of the divine constellation come into play. The cult statue, the celestial bodies associated with them, numbers, semi-precious stones, and other attributes served as access points to the divine. These constellation points, while not part of the core anthropomorphic deity, serve to make the deity visible and thus immanent and make their potency accessible. These points serve to concretize an otherwise distant god. Hundley notes how that celestial bodies were particularly visible manifestations of the deity, and cult statues made the deities more approachable and visible. While a statue of deity is not fully coterminous with the deity itself, they were fully functioning loci of divine presence and thus a primary way of accessing the divine. Let's look at a very brief case study. The goddess Inanna, better known by her Akkadian name Ishtar, was a goddess who had over 200 different temples. The most important ones were at Uruk, Nineveh, and Arbela, but she was venerated throughout Mesopotamia and into Syria over a very long period of time. She was particularly fluid in how she was understood, but her divine constellation has a number of fairly consistent elements. First is her anthropomorphic core. She usually appears as a woman, clothed or not. She is mostly recognizable as female. In some depictions of her, we can see rays emanating from her, meant to show her luminosity or radiance as a deity. She often has a horned cap, which is a common demarcation of divinity in Mesopotamian art, which further marks her as a goddess. She also sometimes has wings, which is often a common artistic marker of the numinous quality of the subject. As for her constellation beyond her divine anthropomorphic form, she was linked with sexuality, not marriage and not motherhood, but sexuality. Her nude depictions may be allusions to this aspect, but she was also linked with war. One text calls the battlefield the playground of Ishtar. In many depictions, we see her armed, sometimes with a bow and arrows or with a quiver on her back. Sometimes she has a sword. We can see these depictions of her recognize this martial aspect of her constellation. She was linked with lions. She's often shown either on a lion or with a lion. And again, this may hint at her warlike attribute, but as a part of her constellation, it could stand in as an emblem for the goddess. Ishtar was also closely linked with the morning star, what we call the planet Venus. In art, this is usually depicted as an 8-pointed star, sometimes in a circle. In many depictions of the goddess, the star is shown nearby, but this symbol came to be so closely associated with her that it often appears on its own as a stand-in for the goddess. It appears on Kuduru stones, stones which often served as boundary markers, often had depictions of the deities before which that land contract was signed. Here we can see Ishtar's symbol amongst many others. On many stelae, we see kings lifting their hands in a gesture of worship to many symbols, including the 8-pointed star of Ishtar. Here we can see a fragmentary head from a statue of a lion that has an 8-pointed star on it. Other things linked with the goddess we know from either excavation or textual sources include the number 15, the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli, lead, occasionally doves. In fact, at the temple of Ishtar in Ashur, excavators found lead doves. This lapis lazuli dove was found in Elam and dates to around 1200 BC. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many more associations linked with Ishtar. She was one of the great goddesses of the ancient Near Eastern pantheon, so she subsumed other aspects and objects of other deities as she grew in significance. These objects were ones that were particularly closely connected to the core of her anthropomorphic constellation core. Same could be said for Shamash, or Marduk, or Sin. This is the core concept of the divine constellation. Finally, if Hundley is right, this model of a divine constellation is generally applicable to places beyond Mesopotamia, as it was how many in the ancient Near East understood the divine world. That brings us to the question, what can we say about the Bible and the divine constellation of Yahweh?
Now, before we dig into this, we want to note a couple of factors that may limit the applicability of Hundley's divine constellation model to understanding Yahweh. Now, first, Yahweh is not a Mesopotamian god, and also Yahweh was not widely worshipped until the Iron Age. So, while the divine constellation model works quite well for Bronze Age Mesopotamia, ancient Israel had somewhat different understandings of divinity and the divine realm, which do impact how they would have understood Yahweh and his divine constellation. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't have an aspect of theological outlook. In fact, we think it's pretty clear that they did, and such a perspective is well suited to developing a divine constellation. But also, Yahweh was most widely worshipped in the Iron Age, a time when scholars recognized that across the ancient Near East, including in Mesopotamia, deities, or at least their depictions, moved away from being anthropomorphized toward being more celestial or numinous. Greater emphasis was placed on their attributes, like their attribute animals, or on the means by which they worked, like the tree and the goddess in Syria-Palestine. Essentially, the deity's anthropomorphic core, while not gone, was not depicted with as great a frequency, with emphasis being placed on other aspects of the divine constellation. So, taken together, it makes sense that Yahweh would have a divine constellation that should be discernible in the text of the Hebrew Bible, even if it doesn't look like the more robust examples we can see in Mesopotamia. Hundley's study of this issue focuses on the non-priestly material in Genesis and Exodus. Essentially, he tries to focus on a subset of the pre-exilic or Iron Age literary material in just Genesis and Exodus. So, his study, which we're heavily relying on, is fairly limited, but it's also probably the richest vein to mine for finding Yahweh's divine constellation. Okay, enough caveats. What might be part of Yahweh's divine constellation? Well, Hundley suggests that Yahweh, like the chief deity in other pantheons like Ashur and Marduk, has a fairly tightly connected and more or less cohesive constellation. For starters, as with other deities in the ancient world, there is a divine anthropomorphic core. Now, I just said that this was de-emphasized in the Iron Age, but we can still see it in the Hebrew Bible. There are many places where Yahweh is anthropomorphized, either described as having human features or performing human behaviors. For example, God walks with Adam in the garden. He shuts the door of the ark. Jacob sees God standing atop a ladder, and although this is in a dream, Jacob takes it to be real. When Moses and the elders see God, they see his feet on a pavement like lapis lazuli, perhaps meant to be the sky, showing he was in heaven, not just on earth. When Moses is in the cleft of the rock and God passes by, God shields him with his hand so that Moses does not see God's face. Now, these all point to God having an anthropomorphic form, a divine body, perhaps even oversized, that can perform human-like actions. This divine body also emanates light, and it seems the light was contagious. Moses' face was radiant after he communed with God. The terror of God is mentioned in Genesis 35, where Jacob receives the name Israel, and terror or fear is a common marker of divinity. But there are other places where the anthropomorphic form of God is left ambiguous. Abraham meets 3 visitors at the trees of Mamre, and it's notable that in some Near Eastern traditions, trees were conduits or access points for the divine. So this may not be simply an incidental setting indicator. Abraham recognizes the 3 visitors as more than just men, and he bows before them. Throughout the story, it remains unclear who exactly these visitors are. Are they messengers of God, or are they God himself? And if it's God, then which one is God? Now, these are questions that could have been clarified in the text, but they're left obscure. We see something similar with the figure that Jacob wrestles at Penuel. The text is ambiguous as to who or what he's wrestling. It's only in a later parenthetical note, likely added as an editorial, that indicates that this is God, although Hosea also clears this up. So, God clearly has, in some biblical traditions, a bodily form, but it's never described in detail. At times, it's ambiguous as to when God is manifesting in that anthropomorphic form, and when it's a messenger or someone affiliated with God. In the stories like Abraham at Mamre and Jacob at Penuel, there is ambiguity as to whether these figures are Yahweh himself or one of his agents. Hundley notes that this ambiguity seems to be intentional, and that this distinction is blurred elsewhere between Yahweh, his message, and his messengers. In most places in the Hebrew Bible, angels or divine messengers don't have a lot of agency. They do what Yahweh instructs them to do, or they deliver a message from Yahweh. There's not a strong distinction between Yahweh, his message, and his messenger. Now, oftentimes the distinction between the messenger or agent of Yahweh is blurred to such an extent that these messengers may be considered as aspects of Yahweh's constellation. Other deities in other cultures had messengers, but they tended to have more agency and distinguishing characteristics. Sometimes they had their own constellation apart from being a messenger for a particular deity. But this isn't the case in the Hebrew Bible. Specific angelic beings having names and agency was a later development in Judeo-Christian beliefs. And the same can be said for cherubim and seraphim. These are numinous hybrid creatures which protect the sacred realm, and they're so closely associated with Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible that it's difficult to disentangle them from Yahweh himself. To know these guardian beings is to know what they are guarding.
Another feature of divine constellations that we see applied to Yahweh is names and epithets. Yahweh is the name of God in the Bible, but he has many epithets. If you've ever done a name of God study at your church or on your own, you might know many of these. These are names which highlight an aspect with which Yahweh is identified. He is the God who sees the downtrodden, El Roi. He is the most powerful and highest deity, El Elyon. Now, some believe that these epithets were originally applied to the Canaanite god El and that later were conflated with Yahweh, and there's merit to that idea. But in the text, these epithets are all applied to Yahweh, even if that was not where they originally derived from. Now, this is something we see commonly in other divine constellations, reputation poaching, where one aspect or power of a deity is subsumed by another as a means of enhancing that deity's standing. It's notable we don't see localized names of Yahweh in the Bible. There's no Yahweh of Jerusalem and Yahweh of Bethel as different expressions or manifestations of one deity, the way that we see with Ishtar of Arbela and Ishtar of Nineveh and so on. We do see these localizations in archaeology, though. We've talked about Kuntilat Ajrud on this channel before, so if you've seen some of our other videos, you may recall graffito at that site mentioning Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Taman, local expressions of Yahweh in the same vein as how we see local expressions of Ishtar. Now, I briefly want to mention the idea of the Deuteronomistic name theology. For those who may not be familiar with it, this is an interpretation that in Deuteronomy and texts which share its specific theology, Yahweh himself is distinct from his name. Yahweh places his name in certain places, specifically in the temple in Jerusalem, so that his name is hypostatically present, but Yahweh himself is present in heaven. This serves to demythologize away from Yahweh having a bodily form. Now, more recent interpretations no longer understand the theology of Deuteronomy, Samuel, and Kings as reflecting an abstraction of God's presence on earth. This perspective is more nuanced to understand that while God's name is important, it does not deny his localized presence. In fact, I think the idea of the divine constellation works quite well between name theology and divine presence theology, as his name is one part of Yahweh's constellation and one means of knowing and accessing him.
Other manifestations of Yahweh may also be part of his constellation, namely fiery Theophanies. Yahweh appears in fiery forms, most famously to Moses in the burning bush and with the Israelites in the wilderness. But as with his glory in other passages, it seems that the fiery form conceals Yahweh's true form. In Exodus 13, we read that he went before the Israelites in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, not as a pillar of cloud or fire. In the following chapter, we read that the angel of the Lord went from in front of the Israelites to behind them as the Egyptians approached, and that the pillar of cloud followed. It seems that the pillars of cloud and fire are more like means of transport than manifestations of the divine presence. Elsewhere, we see God having storm attributes that operate somewhat similarly. In Psalm 68, God rides on the clouds. In Elijah's contest with the priests of Baal, God sends lightning to ignite the altars. These fire and storm expressions seem to be aspects of Yahweh's constellation, means by which he can be known. Hundley notes that many Near Eastern deities, particularly the chief deity of the pantheon, took on storm attributes even if they were not originally a storm god. We may see something similar with Yahweh, wherein he appropriates storm attributes to signal his status as the chief god overall. For more on this, check out our video about Baal and his storm attributes. One more aspect of Yahweh's constellation has been suggested by John and Josh Walton. They suggest that holiness is an aspect of Yahweh that ought to be linked within his constellation. Now, in the way that abstract ideas like justice are linked with Shamash or sexuality with Ishtar, we can link holiness, sacred separateness, with Yahweh. Anything can be made holy and brought into the orbit of Yahweh's constellation because holiness is so closely linked with Yahweh. It's not an earned status that the people of God can bring on themselves through their own behavior, but it is a conferred status. Moses stands on holy ground. God will make the children of Israel into his own possession, and they will then be a holy people. And in this sense, the people of God are brought into the constellation of Yahweh when the divine attribute of holiness is conferred upon them.
Finally, we want to discuss whether there are physical objects which may or may not be considered part of Yahweh's constellation. Hundley is non-committal on whether he thinks some of these were part of Yahweh's constellation. I would perhaps suggest that there may have been a distinction between the perception of your average Yahwistic worshiper and the perhaps more refined views of those who actually wrote and edited the sacred texts. The average Israelite may have had a more expansive view of a Yahwistic divine constellation. It may have included more physical objects which served as access points, but there's evidence for this even in the text itself. In Genesis 3, God places cherubim to guard Eden. Again, note the close connection between cherubim and Yahweh. In addition to these cherubim, Yahweh also placed a sword there to guard the way to the tree of life. Hundley suggests the more accurate translation is flame of the whirling sword. Now, this may be an object, a kind of divine weapon, like Yahweh is placing his sword, which is called flame of the whirling sword, to guard Eden. There are many examples of weapons of deities being deified in the ancient world and being part of the divine constellation. But it may also be a divine or semi-divine being named Flame, that is, wielding a weapon called Whirling Sword. The text really isn't clear and it could go either way. Other objects, though, seem to be conduits or access points with Yahweh, though perhaps they function differently than other Near Eastern parallels. Moses' staff is a good example. Moses' staff is the means by which Yahweh performs signs and wonders during the Exodus events. It is at Moses' side at the burning bush. It turns into a serpent. It is what Moses uses to turn the Nile to blood. It is ostensibly what Moses raises in his hands in the battle over the Amalekites. It's actually called the staff of God. We're left to wonder if this is meant to be God's personal staff that Moses has on loan, if the staff belongs to God and is an access point to Yahweh's power used by Moses. We see Baal using a staff on the stele from Ugarit, and he uses one in combat. Zimri-Lin, the king of Mari, claims he was given a staff by the storm god to defeat his enemies. But this is not, as Hundley notes, a bidirectional access point, but rather an object through which Yahweh chooses to work. God is extending his reach with the staff. Moses is not using it to access Yahweh's power when he wants to. This is at least how it is presented in Exodus, but it's unclear to me if it may have been understood differently by those outside of the Israelite literati. Maybe your everyday Israelite heard that story and thought of Moses' staff as a means of access to Yahweh himself. The same may be said for Jacob's pillar he set up at Bethel. After his dream where he sees a ladder descending to earth from heaven, he sets up the stone he slept on as a pillar. He pours oil on it after he sets it up. While this may just be a memorial stone, he does anoint it with oil as a means of setting it apart and elevating its status, and only later sets up an altar at Bethel. This suggests that the stone may have been understood as a kind of extension of the divine presence Jacob experienced in his dream, not just as an altar or a memorial. He may have even been offering oil as an offering rather than just anointing it. It may have been understood as a particularly potent conduit between heaven and earth, or even more, as a surrogate divine body worthy of receiving offerings on its own, unmediated by an altar. We also see Yahweh having associations with calves, which, at least popularly, may have been his attribute animal. Calves are filled with potential. They're youthful and energetic and filled with latent potency that may be realized as full-grown bulls, so is a formidable attribute for a deity. We see this at the cult stand from Ta'anak, for example. We also see it in Exodus, where Aaron makes a golden calf, which is, of course, linked with the account of Jeroboam establishing Yahwistic cult shrines in Bethel and Dan with calf statues. If you want to learn more about that connection, check out our video on the golden calf here. Now, Hundley notes that not all of these objects and associations were necessarily considered part of Yahweh's divine constellation. The calves in particular are condemned in biblical passages, but we must also consider that the text as it stands represents the final iteration in a long developing tradition. Things like calf images may have been at one point a tolerated, if not accepted, Yahwistic expression, particularly amongst your average Israelite worshiper, and especially among Israelites as opposed to Judahites. So through these discussions and elucidating the Yahwistic constellation, there's an attention in identifying it through the text while recognizing that the text does not reflect all of the Yahwistic customs that were practiced in the ancient world.
Now that leads us to a final important question. Maybe you've been asking that as you've watched for a while now. So what? After everything we've covered, how does this idea of a divine constellation help us today? Well, in addition to helping us understand how ancient people conceived of their deities, I think the most relevant takeaway for us today is not so much in the divine constellation itself, but in the approach to theology that it represents. Now, like we said at the beginning, modern systematic theology, at least Christian theology, is highly deductive, working from big premises down to the specifics. There have been more recent movements in postmodern theology toward an emphasis on narrative or the highlighting of marginalized voices. But by and large, the field of theology, broadly conceived, follows this perspectival approach. Now, I think a lot of that can be attributed to the legacy of Greco-Roman philosophy and its influence on the intellectual life of the Western Church, in both style and substance. From the patristic authors through the medieval period, the Reformation, and into late modernity, a deductive approach to theology has been the reigning approach. Now, by contrast, the idea of aspective theology is largely lost in modern theology, but it's what we see all over the Bible, and not just in the Hebrew Bible. We see aspective theology in the parables of Jesus. Jesus doesn't give a treatise of systematic beliefs. He tells parables about the kingdom of heaven and what life with God is like, with each parable adding a new dimension to the whole. Jesus even describes himself in aspects: the bread of life, the light of the world, the good shepherd, the way, the truth, and the life, rather than in doctrinal statements. You could say that Jesus was kind of crafting a divine constellation around himself rather than reducing his divine nature to a set of core beliefs. This aspective approach should lead to an expansiveness in our view of God, rather than an effort to only categorize and systematize. Modern theology would do well to grapple not just with the content of the biblical text and what we can deduce from it, but with how the text itself was written. Systematizing God and forcing him into our categories is tricky, if not impossible. The aspective model is not how theologians practice theology today, but it's how the biblical authors did theology, and that is significant. Now, I'm not dismissing the value of systematic theology by any means. I've studied it and I find great value in it. And I do think it's vitally important to understand and pass on a set of core beliefs that ground us in the truth about God. But I also think that there's great value in recognizing that our finite categories cannot contain an infinite God. And if that's true, I think it's a good thing for us to start smaller and work our way to a bigger picture of who God really is. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out our references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed seeing this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out our video on the golden calf. And we also have a bunch of videos on ancient Near Eastern gods and their attributes. Finally, if you want to support the work that we're doing, you can become one of our Beneath the Bible excavators through channel membership at the Join button down below. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to each video we publish, and you'll get to be part of a monthly video call with us. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.